Tensions between space and memory, movement and mobility in digitally reconstructing the Bawean Ponthuk. Hello everybody, my name is Hadi Osni and I am a PhD candidate at the Department of Architecture in the National University of Singapore. And I will start my presentation with a quick summary before I jump into the presentation proper. So in this presentation, I hope to examine the relationship between space and memory, exploring the spatiality of memory and the potential contradictions as interviewees attempt to recount their memories in relation to space. I will then explore movement and mobility as a method of documentation that may harness the spatiality of memory, aiding interviewees to recall their memories while accounting for the inherent contradictions as interviewees recount and recalibrate their memories in relation to space. I suggest that augmenting existing methods of oral history interviews and 3D preservation by incorporating the dimension of space and place to aid in the digital reconstruction of lost architecture and its social context. To start the presentation proper, as an introduction to the project, in recent years, anxiety and nostalgia over the dilution of Baweanese identity amongst the younger generation formed the backdrop for various publications by the Baweanese Association of Singapore, supported by the National Heritage Board, that attempted to canonize Baweanese heritage in Singapore. In 2018, PBS produced a heritage publication, Ponthuk Bawean di Singapura, and it highlights and records the memories of former Ahli Ponthuk, that is, Ponthuk residents, of 42 Ponthuk across 6 areas in Singapore. So, for a little bit of context, the Ponthuk in British Malaya served as lodging houses for Baweanese migrants or perantau during the colonial era all the way up to the 1960s. It predominantly occupied urban forms such as what we can see over here, shop houses, compound houses, that were rented out to the Baweanese perantau in towns where the Baweanese diaspora had spread, including Singapore. For some context, I am a fourth generation Baweanese. I was born in Singapore. My great grandfather actually migrated to Singapore in the 1920s. And as an architecture student, when the publication's editor invited me to make contributions to the book, it naturally came with the digital reconstruction of lost architecture that is the Pondok, through axonometric plans of the various Ponthuks that publication intended to document. The process of digitally reconstruct the Bawean Ponthuk, however, has revealed various tensions between space and memory. Now, various scholars have actually sought to demonstrate the relationship between memory and space. For instance, Yifu Tuan argues that individual remembers a space as place by having been in them and walking through them, developing the ability to move through it unthinkingly, or what he refers to as kinesthetic familiarity. One may also experience the present world casually connected to the past through memories associated with physical space and objects. Memory aids adds a further dimension to the relationship between space and memory by expounding upon how the physicality of a place may aid one to structure his memory. And in this way, the spatiality of memory may serve as an aid for one to recall their memories associated with space and place. Now, despite the potency of spatiality of memory, my fieldwork for the heritage publication, dialectical issues relating to the ephemeral nature of memory and its tenuous relationship with space arose. First, the digital reconstruction of the physical form of the Pondok, relying exclusively on existing conserved buildings and archival drawings, may not capture how former residents related to the spaces around them through everyday life practices. This element is critical because given that the Ponthuk was not a vernacular form to the Baweanese community, the Pondok actually occupied urban forms that were unlike traditional buildings back from the homeland. And migrants had to provisionally appropriate the spaces within these urban forms to revive practices of daily life to facilitate their social and cultural needs. through weddings, gender organization, everyday activities, segregation of spaces. Moreover, given that migrants had rented out such buildings, these appropriations were limited to the interior of the building and had to be provisional. And in the case of the Pondok, everyday life practices may instead be embedded in the accounts of the habits of movement, the use of physical objects, as well as the unintended use of spaces from the building's initial design. But on the other hand, memory tends to be subjective and dynamic, and as such often contravenes physical dimensions found in existing conserved buildings and archival drawings. This is evidenced by various diagrammatic floor plans that I've put in the slide over here that was initially produced for the heritage publication. So interviewees' memories may not necessarily emphasize the accuracy and the precise physical dimensions in recounting daily life and special occasions. So, for instance, what we may find is that spaces where communal activities took place may appear oversized, and inversely, spaces that were private and confined, such as private bedrooms, may appear undersized. Now, in recent years, geographers have turned towards movement and mobility as a method in the investigation of everyday life practices. The walking interview, in particular, has emerged as a core practice of geographers interested in place identity and urban change. This approach may harness the spatiality of memory. The environment acts, in this particular case, as a visual and auditory prompt, aiding interviewees to recall their memories. Within the context of the digital reconstruction of the Pondok, however, it must be noted that buildings that once housed the Pondok, most of them have been demolished. And while several buildings may have been conserved, the interiors of these privately owned buildings are mostly inaccessible or even completely refurbished. So in this picture over here is Haji Basri Alang showing off the land in which the Ponthuk he grew up in once stood. And as you can see, it's no longer there. All that is left of the building is actually this particular one side of the gate entrance, not even the whole entrance. Over here at the bottom here, you can see this is 33 Everton Road, where my father and my grandmother were actually born. But its interiors have now been completely refurbished and unrecognizable to those who used to live in them. Hence, for this project, what we were forced to do primarily is to rely upon traditional methods of sedentary interviews. Now, it may seem a bit contradictory, but if we could somehow integrate movement and mobility to augment these sedentary interviews by relying upon and what I refer to as an experiential approach as interviewees recall their memories of space. So the interview places the account of the interviewee's experience as the central method by which the researcher may come to know the interior layout of the Pondok and its relationship with everyday life practices. Now, this is achieved by structuring the interview around what we call a base plan that is generated from, where possible, existing conserved buildings, archival building drawings, archival maps, and even archival or personal photographs. Now, the archival drawings, personal photographs, historic maps may serve as a supplementary stimulus to encourage the interviewee to provide further information throughout the interview. So, interviewees tour or take the author through the Pondok, constantly referring to the base plan to capture their kinesthetic familiarity with the space. Now, these movements spatializes memories, providing a critical insight into everyday life and the use of spaces. What we must note is that each account is unique as the interviewee takes the interviewers through different perspectives that are shaped by gender, relations to other residents, age at the time that they had lived in the Pondok, as well as the time frame that they were referring to. Now, these habits of movement may be reflected in various ways, from the different places from which they started their tour, to the experiences of different levels of privacy due to the social boundaries that may separate physically adjacent spaces. To map memories, what I have done is I prompt interviewees to stop at significant nodes that are designated by daily physical objects to recount routines of everyday life, and special occasions, as well as the unintended use of spaces from the building's original initial design to facilitate their social and cultural needs. And in this way, the experiential approach of interviewing former residents defines space as the interviewee's bodily movements towards or away from spaces of daily objects, which are in constant dialogue with the base plan. Now, this augmented movement and mobility approach that is constantly in dialogue with the base plan, as well as the supplementary stimulus for memory throughout interviews, as what we may refer to as material probes. Even though the interview was physically sedentary, the environment of the Ponthuk still managed to act as a visual and auditory prompt. This allowed interviews to be more forthcoming, and most interviews also found it easier to better recall peculiarities associated with physical spaces they might not have been able to recall without. Now, interviewees also tended to verbalize attitudes and feelings, what we call in place, revealing the spatial experiences and the mental images of the Ponthuk as results of the social boundaries and behavioral expectations that govern these spaces. So this method also allowed interviewers to recalibrate their memories when contradictions in relation to physical dimensions arose. So spaces that were usually recounted based on the vague enumeration of people who occupied these spaces, such as how many family members were living in the Ponthuk, how many children that they have, and how many of them could fit within a particular room. These spaces were actually corroborated based on a base plan that was generated, as I said earlier, through archival maps and photographs, but more importantly, an architectural understanding of the typical plan and the interior layouts of these urban forms, and hence these spaces were resized accordingly. So in this particular example, if we were to refer to the diagrammatic floor plans that were initially produced, areas where activities initially occurred, such as over here, you can see that the Serambi here was elongated and oversized, right? And inversely, the areas in which bedrooms that were further subdivided into smaller cubicles were improbably compact. To refer to archival plans, as you can see, as I highlighted over here, this is the outline of the compound house in which this Ponthuk actually occupied. And as you can see, based on the outline of the building, and if you draw some reference to the diagrammatic plan, there is some correlations, amazingly. Even you can see that all the way down to the vestibule here that is actually used as a shower. And if you resize the buildings and correlate it with an understanding of the typical architectural space of a compound house, we will start to see that these spaces that were described actually start to take place within the reconstructed Ponthuk. As well, these findings were also corroborated by personal photographs, as you can see over here, with the building in the background. This is another example where there were no plans of the buildings, and we had to rely mostly on hand-drawn plans, and as well as an architectural understanding again of the typical plan and the interior layout of a shophouse this time. And the size of the building, we had the descriptions of the Ponthuk based on the typical size of the shophouse. And in both these examples that I've shown earlier, the physical building no longer exists. Thus, the walking interview to document these buildings were not possible. However, using this augmented method and relying upon existing understanding of architectural space, these buildings start to take some shape, and when we corroborate this, they start to be more forthcoming with their information, and most importantly, they have participants take charge and they lead these interviews. Now, what is more interesting as in my research is that these interviews reveal details of the provisional appropriation of space within the buildings that were not captured in archival drawings and maps, right? But then they captured how former residents related to spaces around them through everyday life. Now, accounts of the habits of movement, use of daily physical objects, as well as the unintended use of spaces from the building's initial design revealed various continuities in the spatial and social cultural practices between the Bawean Ponthuk and the homeland. And various anthropological studies of the Baweanese have anecdotally noted the continuities in the spatial and social cultural practices between the Bawean Ponthuk and the homeland, though they have not focused on how these spatial cultures were translated from its original context back in the homeland into the urban context. However, we realize that these spatial cultures were perpetuated and mutually confirmed by earlier generation of migrants who attempted to provisionally appropriate an unfamiliar urban environment as a means to revive practices of daily life from the homeland and facilitate their social cultural needs. And in this way, it's no surprise that the materialization by which Baweanese cultural traditions were discussed even today in publication of Baweanese heritage in Singapore is that of the Pondo. Now, I wish to conclude by referring to Mary Stander, who researches on the potential and challenges of the cross-disciplinary field of architectural anthropology. She notes that the material turn in the field of anthropology has claimed a new focus on how physical spaces leave imprints in a community, not just as a backdrop to social life, but as an active part of it. And she traces postmodern linguistics approaches that raise what she refers to as controversial questions on the tools that anthropologists have to listen to physical objects. She writes, we may carefully listen to what people say about their houses. We may observe how they use and interact with the spaces around them. But how do we approach what the house itself might be doing or saying? How do we know how to interview a house or do field work not just in but among buildings? So she argues, and I likewise agree, that any ethnographic attempt to analyze what a building does would have to be approached through the social life that takes place in and around it. I thereby suggest that the approach that I have discussed here today may augment existing methods of oral history interviews and 3D preservation by incorporating the dimension of space and place to aid the digital reconstruction of lost architecture and its social context. Thank you.